So something I get asked every time, and it happened again this week, a number of times actually, people were asking me about mouthpieces. How do you choose a mouthpiece? There's too many options. There's hard rubber mouthpieces, there's metal mouthpieces, there's different size tip openings, there's all sorts of options. How do you start choosing, particularly if you're making that choice from a beginner mouthpiece, upgrading to your next more advanced mouthpiece? So I thought in this video we're going to have a chat with Theo Wanne, who's one of the world masters on mouthpieces these days, and get the answer from him. Just before we do that though, I should tell you, so I run Sax School, which is a huge online community of saxophone learners. We've got thousands of people learning from my library of lessons. We've got hundreds of lessons and courses on improvising and technique and tone and altissimo and learning the blues and all sorts of things like that. You can check it out for a 30-day trial for free actually if you're interested to have a look. I'll put the link up here, and it's free. Go and have a look and see if it's right for you. Anyway, so let's get on with this chat. So I called up Theo this week and I asked him if I was upgrading. I'm just thinking about, if I was in that position where I'm upgrading for the first time from a beginner mouthpiece to my next more advanced mouthpiece. So I asked Theo, how would I make a choice about what sort of mouthpiece would be right for me? Here's what he said.
Well, I'd like to start off by talking about the importance of the saxophone mouthpiece, because this is what got me into manufacturing in the very first place. And I think in the saxophone world, the mouthpiece is often a little bit taken for granted because people focus on the saxophone. But the truth is that the mouthpiece is really what creates our sound. Its purpose is to create the type of sound we get. So, for example, a rock and roll player or a smooth jazz player or a classical player or jazz player would use an incredibly different design of mouthpiece, but they might all play the same Selmer Mark 6, or they might play the same Yamaha, or they might play the exact same brand and style of saxophone, but there's no chance that they would play the same mouthpiece, right?
That's really interesting. So what you're saying is that the mouthpiece is the thing that really gives them that different quality of sound, or gives them the sounds that they need in order to play in that different kind of style.
That's right, yeah. And so I started out, as you know, as a mouthpiece refacer.
Oh, by the way, I should just tell you, if you don't know who Theo Wanne is, he's an amazing saxophone mouthpiece maker. In fact, he made this very mouthpiece. This is a Theo Wanne Slant Sig, and I use his mouthpieces actually on my alto as well. They're brilliant. So he's a guy that really knows his stuff.
So I got to see this very much firsthand when I would have customers come sit down next to me, and they'd say, well, I like this mouthpiece, but can you change it? Can you do this? Can you do that? And then I would just see people light up. I mean, as I would work on their mouthpiece, and I would dial it in to where it helped them access something inside themselves that they were struggling getting to, right? Oh. I mean, and if you're fighting the mouthpiece, it doesn't matter how great your saxophone is. I mean, you're going to hang it up and call it a day and find another sport. And so, I would have students come in, or intermediary players or pros, and they would all have the same response when they found the mouthpiece, or I was able to dial in a mouthpiece to be exactly what they were looking for. I mean, that's what got me. That's why I make mouthpieces now. I mean, that's why I continued refacing mouthpieces, because I got addicted to that response from people.
Yeah, right? And I think also as a player, it's if that you were talking about not struggling with your mouthpiece, that's a big thing. But also if your mouthpiece gives you that sound that you've got in your mind, then all of a sudden it inspires you to play in a different way. And also if you're a beginner or an intermediate player, it inspires you to play more. So
exactly.
Yeah. So, it's really confusing, I think, if you're pretty new to the whole mouthpiece selection process. There's so many different options. So it's really confusing to know which way to go. And the biggest question, or the biggest obvious differentiator when they go to the mouthpiece shop is there's hard rubber ones and there's metal ones. So how do they know whether to go for, how do they know which one to choose? Because there's those sort of options, and there's things like the tip openings, and there's things like baffles and all these other sorts of ways that mouthpieces are measured. So how does, if they came to you and said, Theo, I want to sound like this, then you could make them something. But if they were just going and they've got a huge selection of things to choose from, how do they know which one, where do they start?
Right. So the correct answer is too general, so that I'll dial it down. But the correct answer really is play on the mouthpiece that makes you feel free.
Hey, I love that one. I hope you caught that. Choose the mouthpiece that makes you feel free. How simple is that? And what a great way to approach choosing a mouthpiece, because at the end of the day, it's not about, who plays which mouthpiece or which mouthpiece has got the best marketing. It's about which mouthpiece works for you. Top tip.
And that same goes true for a reed, as well, right? So from my perspective, because I've got a chance to work with a lot, thousands and thousands of players personally, to helping them choose the right gear. And I can tell you that there is no right answer. Some of these pros that are just incredible, and then you're like, what are you playing on there? Like a 5-star mouthpiece with a number 2 reed. And I'm like, right? And then there's some guys, like Joshua Redmond used to come over and he's playing a 7-star with a number 5 reed, right? I couldn't even get a sound, So, some of these other guys are playing 130, 140 mouthpieces. And so I don't always suggest students try to copy their heroes necessarily, what their hero's gear is, because some of these guys who practice and play all day long, they have, abdomens that probably would make a bodybuilder proud from, breath support, right?
Yep.
So focusing on getting the type of sound, just that you feel the magic when you're playing, that's the goal, right? And like you said before, that's what's going to get people to practice more.
Yeah. And it's going to bring the passion of playing to you as well. So basically what you're saying is, although there's loads of different options when you go to choose a mouthpiece, the starting point really has to be you going and trying lots of different things to find what suits you.
That's right. And don't be afraid to play something a little softer or smaller, or, just because you heard that, if you're a good player, you should have a harder reed, or you should have a bigger tip opening mouthpiece, or you should, right? I'm not a believer in the shoulds anymore, because,
it's really, really good to hear you say that, because I completely agree. And actually, as I've gotten older, and I've been a pro player for a long time, and my equipment has got smaller actually, certainly like reed softer and things like that, because I think it's more about the tone rather than just going for that big thing. Do you think that's one of the mistakes that people make when they first start choosing mouthpieces?
Yes, I do. Or a reed that's too hard, because then they're struggling, and then you're going to get frustrated, right? So being able to feel free is the whole point. And oh my gosh, seeing musicians just feel free, and I can't tell you the number of feedback I get, and they're all about people feeling free. I had one guy write me, and he said he got one of our mouthpieces, and then he was upstairs practicing, and his wife didn't know we got a new mouthpiece. And then all of a sudden he hears from down below, it's like, honey, what are you doing? Something's different. You're more creative than I've ever heard you before. What's going on? And he wrote me and he said, it was just something, a creative center in me opened up, and I just didn't want to stop practicing. And so for students, and for students and parents, you want to get your kids there. You want to get, or if, you're buying a mouthpiece for yourself, you want to get there so that you're, instead of practicing 10 minutes a day, you practice for 2 hours a day just because you're having so much fun. So that said, we can talk briefly now about some of the features of the mouthpiece, if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that's quite interesting. Like I was saying before, what's a baffle? What's a tip opening? How is it relevant to you as a person choosing a mouthpiece?
Yeah, and so talking about like the facing and how flat the table is and the facing curve of the mouthpiece have a lot to do with how well a mouthpiece is going to respond. And this is why oftentimes a low-cost mouthpiece, as tempting as it might be, you know, or kind of like some of the mass-produced popular mouthpieces that are out there, just as much as we might want that to work, the manufacturing processes just are, well, to put it as politely as I can, too kind of loose.
I understand. Yeah.
Right? Just to actually work properly, because the reed surface, if you think about it, the reed's got to vibrate very fast along a curve, right?
Okay.
Anywhere that curve is out, or that table's not flat, right, is going to make that reed work harder, which means you, as the person putting air in, is going to have to work unnecessarily hard. Right. And while I'm a believer in sometimes having some resistance is a good thing, that's not the place to get the resistance. If you want more resistance, get a little bigger tip opening.
Hey, that's a really good point. So Theo's talking about the table of the mouthpiece, which is the flat part that the reed connects onto. And what he's saying is that the flat part here on a better quality mouthpiece is more accurately manufactured, so that the reed can make a really good seal against it and it can vibrate freely. And otherwise, if there's issues with the table here and it's not made properly, the reed is going to struggle to vibrate and it's going to make it much harder for you to play. It's a really, really good point. That's one of the big benefits of upgrading your mouthpiece.
If you're getting the resistance from the facing curve and the table, then you're locked in. You have to push just to get the sound to produce. Yep. Right? Whereas if you're getting the resistance from the tip opening, you can back off. You can get pianissimo. You can articulate still very cleanly, right? So having a saxophone whose pads are seal well, right, is like more important than having a saxophone that's the world's best saxophone but is leaking all over the place, right?
Yep. Yeah, everyone knows that. And it's the same with mouth, right?
That's right. But the problem is you can get a student model saxophone, you know, that has good sealing pads, if, you know, or take it to the repair tech. But boy, getting a mouthpiece that's a kind of a student model mouthpiece comes along with leaky pads, or comes along with, and a lot of it has to do with the manufacturing method.
Okay.
Right. So that's why I haven't come out with very low price mouthpieces yet. But I plan on it. My technology is finally getting to the place where I'll be able to do that. So when you finally see a Theo Wanne mouthpiece that's at a low price, you'll know, okay, the facing curve is going to be nuts on.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting though, Theo. That makes sense. You know, that's a reason why they're priced the way they are. I mean, presumably there's a lot of work and technology that goes into getting that facing just right, so that it really does, allow the reed to seal and make everything work well.
That's right. And hand facing is not necessarily better. In fact, usually hand facing kind of got a good reputation because in the beginning, machined facing and machined baffles and machined mouthpieces, technology was not there to actually do them accurately, right? So then you'd have to go in by hand and fix it, right? Okay. So that's when hand facing, and I'm a master at hand facing. So you know, when I say this, I say this with respect for all aspects, right? But if you can get a machine to accurately produce to 1/10 of a thousandth of an inch all aspects of a facing or a baffle, you're going to get repeatability and an accuracy that a hand facer actually can't do.
Right. Wow.
Yeah, you're going to get, with the handwork, you're going to get a variation from piece to piece to piece. That's not actually a good thing, because you're shooting for a bar, right? A quality level, right? And the more closer you can get to that quality level consistently, the better. So if you've got variations within a product, you're only getting a small percentage that are close to that, that bar, and the rest are going to be less, right? Not as good, right? So that's why I've invested an insane amount of money in technology, just an absolutely insane amount. And that's why, right? I'm very capable of producing mouthpieces by hand at a very high level, and we still hand check and do a small amount of hand facing to fix any particular issues because we want perfection. But we're starting at such a high level of consistency to begin with. Quite frankly, it's quite easy.
Man, there's some good stuff there about facings, and crazy to think that this was always done by hand. Now mostly they're done by really advanced machines, and that's why the accuracy is so important that Theo's talking about. But what about tip opening? I asked Theo about tip openings too.
Okay, so people know when you've got your mouthpiece and then you've got the reed, the tip opening, right? So if this is the facing right here, and this piece is the reed, just the hand, not the arm here, right? Okay. And then where the reed goes, this gap, right? That's the tip opening size, right? And oh boy, I wish all the us mouthpiece manufacturers could sit in a room together and I'll decide and say, okay, this number or this letter means this actual measurement of size, this many thousandths of an inch or this many millimeters. But
yeah, that's a good question actually, Theo, because it's not consistent across makers, is it?
It's not consistent. No. So if you see a 5 in one mouthpiece, it does not mean the same thing in another mouthpiece.
Yeah, that's pretty confusing because then if you're pretty inexperienced at this, and you think, well, I play a 5 on this brand, why can't I just get a 5 over there?
Right.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so a lot of mouthpiece manufacturers, like myself included, on our websites will have like a tip opening chart. So if you're used to playing one mouthpiece as 5, you can look and see what the equivalent will be in another in another brand. Be sure and check that. Yeah. So most students start with a fairly small tip opening. And again, it's because it takes less breath support, right? So, and there's nothing to be embarrassed about with that. Some pros I know play a fairly small tip opening, right?
And you can always balance tip opening with the reed strength, right?
Yes. And in the beginning, actually, like in the 1940s, 1950s, kind of in the heyday as jazz was really blooming, there weren't big tip openings. A number 5 would have thought of kind of like a number 10 is today. I mean, it's like...
Really? I didn't know. Oh, that's interesting. So like older guys, you mean like, I don't know, your Lester Youngs and guys like that, they all played on smaller mouthpieces?
Yeah, like number 4s or...
Wow.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'm exaggerating with 4 or 5. So number 6 might be considered like a number 10 is today.
Whereas a 6 today is, probably the point where a lot of people start.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, but what they did then is they had a very different theory. What they did is they used a long lay or a long facing curve. And what that means is that if this is the gap again, right, and this is a short facing curve, this would be a long facing curve.
I understand.
What that means is the back of the reed, right, where the reed is thicker, has to vibrate. And it's much harder to move a thick piece of cane, right, than the thin section. So how they got the resistance they needed was actually by having a long facing curve. But truth be told, that's not as efficient as the way we're doing it today, which is pretty much a medium facing curve. Almost everybody uses a medium facing curve, give or take. And when people say they have a short facing curve, it's really kind of like a short version of a medium. And when they say a long facing, it's kind of a long version of a medium. But we're all kind of in the medium, and that's a good thing, really. Because a short facing curve, like some of the old Brillhart mouthpieces, right, that you've seen pictures of like Gene Ammons or Charlie Parker playing on, right?
Yep.
Those are actually really great sounding mouthpieces, but they never caught on simply because of the facing curve. They used a very short facing. And so people would play them and go, well, the upper register sounds good, but when I get to the lower register, right, all of a sudden it's choking off. And that had to do with the facing sizes. And you'll also notice, like with the facing curve length, And
Okay.
same thing is true with the larger tip opening sizes of Selmer. So you'll see a lot of Selmer soloist mouthpieces that were like C stars, but not very many of the G's and H's. And the reason is because Selmer, when they got to the big tip opening sizes, they used a short facing, whereas actually on the smaller tip opening sizes, they used a medium. And same reason, they choked off. So as a mouthpiece refacer, I would take those Selmers or Brill Hearts and put a medium facing, and then all of a sudden, voila, you've got this great playing mouthpiece. But with modern mouthpieces today, it's not too much of a concern. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Unless you are buying an old mouthpiece, people buying old mouthpieces on eBay, and you might get an unexpected result, I suppose, if you bought one of those older style mouthpieces. That's really interesting. I didn't know that. So what about internally? Because there's loads of things happening inside a mouthpiece. Is that something that if I was choosing a mouthpiece and I didn't know a lot about it, what should I be looking for, or what should I be wary of? Right.
So the two main sections inside the mouthpiece that we talk about most are the baffle and the chamber. So to recap, with the facing curve, most facings being made today are around the medium range, so you don't have to worry about the facing length too much. You can kind of ignore that. I mean, I'm generalizing, but what you want to be sure is you've got a quality mouthpiece that has a good, even facing curve and flat table, right? So quality as far as facing is much more important than any nomenclature you might see. Now, with the baffle and the chamber, though, the nomenclature you see is very, very important.
All right, stay with us here. This is really important stuff. We're talking about the baffle, which is the internal shape right inside here, inside your mouthpiece. It makes a massive difference to your sound. Check this out.
You've got a high baffle, a rollover baffle, and a flat baffle, and then there's also a concave baffle, but concave is so rare and it's mixed in that it's probably best just to ignore that for right now.
Okay.
And focus on a step baffle, high baffle mouthpiece. That's going to be like your Dukoff superpower chamber, right? Where you see that step.
Yeah.
Right? You see a step there. Or like a Dave Gardella, Super King, or even Brecker model. You'll see a step baffle. And the reason we call it a step is because it looks like a step on a staircase, right? It just goes and then drops down. Right? So, and then the rollover baffle, and then the flat baffle. So the flat baffle being the darkest one is from the very tip rail, you basically got a straight line going down into the chamber, right? Versus a step is much higher. A rollover is like a flat baffle, but it's got a round right at the tip, right? Okay. And that round acts like a very, very, very short step baffle. It's not a step, but like acts like to get some more overtones in the sound. So here's the way to think about this. If you've got a hose, right? So, I grew up with a brother, and so we were always playing, right? And I'd be out there with the hose, and you see your brother walk by or something, right? And the hose, when you just got it in your hand, it's like a flat baffle. Like the water's just coming out, and it's in this big stream, and it's not going very far, right? Which is good to get a lot of water in a little place, right? But as soon as I saw my brother come out there, right, I want to spray him, right? I'm a brother, right? I'm a twin, right? So what do? You stick your finger over the end of the hose, right? And as you're sticking your finger over the end of the hose, you're basically making the space that the water can come through smaller. So you've got the same volume of water going through a smaller aperture. So that water must travel at a faster velocity, right?
In order to get out.
The same volume through, right?
Yeah.
And what that faster velocity does is it means it travels with more momentum and it goes further. This translates as a bright sound, right, in sound. And a dark sound would be the low baffle, a lot of air going not very far, but in a big chunk, right?
That's a great way to describe it, definitely.
And then the rollover would be right in between the two, right? With
Yeah.
some sparkle, some spray, like you're getting some spray in the sound, which is overtones, but but still a fat, you know, darker sound.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. So that's a great way to think about it. And you know, someone would choose a mouthpiece with one of those big baffles in if they were looking for that super bright sound. Maybe if I don't know, in a pop setting or a,
Yep.
you know, that they want lots of projection and a, you know, as
Exactly.
opposed to the other end of the spectrum where you're going to get a warmer, rounder sound. And actually, if you took it all the way, I suppose a classical mouthpiece would be very open.
Yeah. So the way classical mouthpieces do it is they use a very small tip opening with a very low baffle, right? So they get the projection or the clarity they want in the sound through having a small tip opening, but the darkness through a low baffle, right?
Wow.
If you go to a bigger tip opening, right, with a low baffle, you're going to get more of the foofy Ben Webster, you know, Scott Hamilton, you know, Harry Allen type of sound, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Where, you know, whereas, yeah.
Wow,
So,
yeah, it's brilliant.
yeah. So, smooth jazz and pop and rock and roll generally use a high baffle. Jazz musicians, straight ahead jazz musicians, usually use a rollover baffle, right? And then the ballad players or classical players would usually play a flat baffle.
Brilliant. So as a starting point, if you're going in to choose a mouthpiece, then
Yep.
I think that's awesome. What you've talked about there, Theo, would help someone to be able to choose. You know, those are like 3 criteria you could as a starting point. But like you said earlier, it really comes down to experimenting, trying different mouthpieces and seeing what suits you, and also maybe backing it off and not going for the crazy big mouthpiece or the crazy big baffle.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said earlier, you know, a lot of great players use a more moderate setup, but they develop the sound by using that mouthpiece as a starting point and then putting in the work to nurture the sort of sound they're going for.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really great. Awesome. That's brilliant. Thanks, Theo. Oh man, how much information was in that? That was fantastic. I'm so glad that we could have that chat with Theo, and I hope that's been useful to you. Theo knows loads about mouthpieces, and it's great to hear that sort of information directly from him. So if that's been useful to you, let me know in a comment below. I'd love to know if you're using a Theo Wanne mouthpiece, or you know, if those sorts of things have helped you in choosing a mouthpiece yourself, the facing, the table, all that history stuff too about older mouthpieces. Absolutely awesome. So don't forget, if you want to check out Sax School and get involved with our community and start learning using the amazing resources of courses and lessons, hundreds of lessons, you can get the 30-day trial. It's a free trial, so you can check it out yourself and see if it's right for you. I'll put the link up here again, and that's over at McGillmusic.com. But also, if it's your first time here, don't forget to subscribe, because I'm making videos like this all the time, and I'd love for you to catch all of them. I don't want you to miss any of them out. So if you subscribe, you'll get notified when the next video comes out. Right, keep practicing hard. I'll catch you next time.